Through its research and convenings, the Center on Philanthropy and Public Policy seeks to make philanthropy more impactful today and to create a smarter, stronger sector for tomorrow.
You know, we're going to transition now from the neighborhood perspectives to the funder perspective, because as I mentioned, that is where this all started. And we have, three speakers now who are real pioneers, people who have pushed the envelope. You know, one has really pushed the envelope into a broader understanding of health and the social determinants of health and what's possible at a statewide and even national level for philanthropy. We have someone who's pushed the envelope on what is the role of a corporate foundation and the extent to which it can leverage lines of business and other resources within that corporation. And we have a person who's pushed the envelope on truth and integrity so much that no one can say anything that's bull in a meeting without it instantly evaporating. And I'll let you decide who is who. We have two former co-chairs. Wendy Wachtell is the first Los Angeles-based co-chair of Los Angeles Urban Funders and is the president of the Joseph Drown Foundation, as I think you all know. Dannielle Campos is a very senior executive at Bank of America, a director in the ESG division, a top secret division.
I don't even know what it is.
It's actually not. I can just remember what it stands for: Environmental, Social, and Governmental Relations. Thank you. And of course, Dr. Robert Rosbaum, the president and CEO of the California Endowment. Actually, Bob, I'd like to start with you because after leading LA Urban Funders, you actually went off and launched 14 place-based initiatives, the Building Healthy Communities sites at the Endowment. And I'm just wondering, what did you carry from LA Urban Funders into that experience?
I wanted to extend the pain well, first of all, Dannielle and I were joking. I wish we could have just ended the day with the panel that was really remarkable and extraordinary. Thank you, Gloria. Thank you, Mary Lee, and thank you, Patrick, for lifting up the leadership of One Elwood Hopkins on this. I mean, every venture of this type needs, a heart and a soul and a heartbeat, and that was you, Elwood. I mean, for me, two reflections. One at a personal level, because I came in at about the 4-year mark or so, maybe the 5-year mark of LOF. So I was new to LA, new to my job, and new to philanthropy, right? And I don't remember how I took all that newness and became co-chair. I have a feeling that Stuart Quo had something to do with it, Elwood. But Stuart was board chair at the Endowment when the Endowment hired me, and so Stuart was nudging me about LOF. There's this thing called LOF. You got to learn about it. You got to get in it. It's going to be a great introduction for you to learn about LA, to learn about leaders, and he was right. So I cut my teeth in philanthropy and in the world of LA on LOF, quite frankly. It introduced me to a lot of the players in the sectors and neighborhoods and communities. And so for me, it was a very rich and deep time. And then of course, to your question, it introduced me to the notion of place, which we, in the last 7 years of our philanthropic existence at the Endowment, we've had a very powerfully and compelling place-based effort going on statewide. And place, remember those of you that are Star Trek fans, remember the old show? And they would start with the music and that voice of God would come on and would say, space, the final frontier. So place, the final frontier. Place really becomes, and I think the exchange that you saw between the Korean American woman, who's, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, and Mary Lee, is a quintessential example of why working in place is important. Okay? because you can't work in place and escape and ignore and run around issues of race and oppression and history and inequity and all of the structural stuff that shows up in a place. You as a funder, you will learn about that, number one. And number two, you will rethink your grant making strategies as a result. You will learn the hard way or the smart way, but you will learn. And so for us, and for me, LOFT was the way to introduce me and our foundation to the idea of place and all of that comes with. And of course, it's loaded from a public health standpoint with the social determinants of health. So you can't, those visits we had to Pacoima and to Vermont Manchester, and you hear about all this stuff that communities are dealing with that we need to be cognizant about as being effective partners and grant makers. You will learn. So I'll get to the pieces that from the LOFT experience that we added to that about, but for me it was a very, very powerful, important introduction to the power of philanthropy, the power of community and philanthropic partnership, and what it looks like in an authentic way and not a fake way. And lastly, issues of race and inequity and inequality and oppression.
Thank you. Wendy, you as co-chair of the board, I learned a lot from watching you, but what I've never actually asked you explicitly is what was going through your head. What was your view of leading the LOFT board, given that these were institutions that didn't have to collaborate? I mean, how did you view your role? What were the kind of principles you stood for? Were there any kind of moments that stand out for you in your leadership of the LOFT board? But what would you share with someone who has never actually sat in that chair you sat in?
You know, it was an extraordinary moment. I mean, you know, this was, looking back on it 25 years later, it doesn't seem so revolutionary, but what we were doing was really revolutionary. And what Caroline and Dennis asked of me was really quite extraordinary. They had really begun this effort as two Northern Californians and had turned to us and said, okay, Los Angeles, now you've got to figure this out. And Caroline, and really asked Los Angeles to step up and the Los Angeles Foundations to take the leadership role. And so it was to develop that trust and that leadership and build that leadership among the Los Angeles Foundations for the first time. And it was continually to hearken back to the fundamentals of what it is we had all agreed to do when it was really difficult to do that. We were regularly stretching ourselves to the limits. We were on almost every front doing things that we had never done before. We were being asked to pool funds in ways that we had never pooled funds. We were being asked to go back to our institutions and do things that our boards had really never done before. And that in some ways, on the corporate side, asking them to do things that might fly in the face of everything they believed in. We were going into the communities and for the first time really sitting down with the stakeholders in those communities and trying to say, we didn't do this well before. We knew we didn't do this well before. You're equal stakeholders in this conversation, and you may be coming up with something that our boards, you know, if you're a bank, you may be telling us that the banks are doing something wrong, and we're going to have to come to grips with that. And we all had to sort of hold hands together and know we were walking into that. And there was, at every meeting, trying to hold ourselves together, knowing we were doing this because we had not served these communities well, and we were looking for a new model, and we were out on a ledge together, and we were walking that together. So it was taking that deep breath and knowing, and by the way, you were right, we were facing the ridicule of other foundations in Los Angeles while we were walking out on that ledge together. And we bonded together in that process in a very real way. As you can see, when we come into this room today, 25 years later, that still means a lot. We learned a lot from that process together.
Wendy, I want to hold up a mirror to you for a second because you probably noticed, I asked Wendy, what did you do? What was your leadership role? And she answered in we every time. And I think that one of the things you did was you made it very clear that you were not, as a leader, you were sharing the same struggles that everyone else was doing. And you allowed that to be, there was a particular style of leadership there that never, I don't know, it just always felt like you were part of the collective, which of course you were, but not everyone would have done that.
Well, we were in this together.
Dannielle, I want to ask you a question. You know, you as a corporate funder, I mean, maybe say a little bit about how you think corporate funders are generally perceived, and then differentiate that in terms of describing how you really brought resources of Bank of America to bear on LOF, and what you were able to bring to the table that was a little bit different, perhaps, than others who were not part of corporations.
Aside from that being Caroline Boitano, the pioneer, the trailblazer here, let me just first say it's good to be home. I know a lot of people are saying, where are you, Dannielle? Are you still at Bank of America? What are you doing? I'm still based in LA. I'm on the national platform, but like everyone has alluded to walk into this room and see a lot of folks that I've learned from, that I've met. This is the network. Like Bob, I was new. Thank God Caroline hired me and brought me to the LOF table, and I've met Antonio Manning. I met Jonathan Weedman, Elwood Hopkins, a lot of folks, and if that's not just ground in terms of the networks and the friendships with the community as well as with our funders, if that's not something, a testament to this work, then I don't know what is. But I want to thank all of you in the room who welcomed me I've been with the company over 24 years, so I always say now I'm...
That's 48 years for a non-bank.
No, I've seen nearly 24 years. Brought in to work on internship program, coordinating high school internship programs at Belmont High School in Fouché. And then I had the privilege also of not working for Caroline, but also working for Carla Dardis, who ran our small business investment program at the time. And talk about a learning by fire, economic development coming in. You know, we did that small business investment program, and I think if Roberto's still in the room, he would argue that that was the most trailblazing that the bank program that the bank did at the time, was make 300 loans to borrowers in those 3 communities that were impacted by the civil unrest. So I came in with that lens in terms of we are an economic development institution, we are a bank, but we're also the philanthropic arm too. And I think what Caroline did in terms of bringing, you know, Bank of America as a leader was creating that way for corporates to have a voice in place-based work. I would argue that sometimes people feel like banks should not be invited into this work. I would argue that community organizations don't understand or think that we don't understand what it means to drive social change in communities. Well, guess what we do? And as Raul Bustillos alluded to, it is an evolution. It has been an evolution. We continue to look inside and think about the resources we can bring to bear, not just through philanthropy, through our volunteers, through our community development banks. Cindy Spivak is here. Through our retail, Quentin Strode was with us at the time running the region at the bank. I mean, we were at a moment where we could bring all our resources around the table, not just philanthropy, and have the conversation internally. Mm-hmm. And I think that for us was the learning as well, and continues to be a learning today as we think about ESG and what that narrative is for us to bring economic opportunities to the communities that we serve and we work. I mean, clearly LA is our place, right? And over the last 2 decades, we've gone through some evolutions and changes as a financial institution. Definitely not. People would say, you're still at Bank of America. I'm like, well, when I started Bank of America, it was very different than it is today. I mean, a global institution. So LA was a place that even, I would say, when other organizations and institutions, we merged or bought, or how you say, they would say, if we don't do it right in LA, we won't do it right in other communities across the country. So I do think that the fact that we were able to come to the table, actually we paved the way for other corporations to play a role too.
Yeah, so I think Bank of America, Chase, Wells Fargo all played very good roles. I remember when Caroline used to say that the Bank of America Foundation, she felt like you were eunuchs in the palace.
That sounds.
Wait a minute, you said that or she said that?
She said that. and I have to.
All of a sudden I'm thinking Game of Thrones.
Yeah, I try not to think too much about that, but I think, the idea that, gee, those guys are great, but what are they doing here? You really did bring a lot of business line resources to the table, as did your colleagues, and I think more than anywhere else I've seen in law, a corporation demonstrate that the foundation is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what kind of resources can be leveraged in small business lending and in home financing and in financial education and so on. So credit where credit is due. Bob, I want to ask you to step outside of the role of the California Endowment and think about philanthropy generally. To what extent do you, one of LOFT's goals was a big one. It's like, we want to change funder behavior, we want to transform philanthropy. And the interesting thing is, I think we've all read proposals and documents that make bold goals, like we want to change this or change that. I actually think we did on this particular front, and I think this is what it looks like. But I was wondering, do you have thoughts on how LOFT impacted philanthropy as a field in Southern California, for better or for worse?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think, so let's talk about the moment. Okay, so we're having this conversation, we're downloading these lessons at this moment, right? And the moment is that there is a politically powerful narrative that is between dangerous and mean-spirited and at odds with everything we've come to believe and work for here in LA. I went to there were a number of 25-year recognition, it's hard to call them celebrations, of those of us who are from outside. You can tell who's from LA and who's from not, because people from outside of LA call it the riots, and people from LA call it something else, the unrest, the rebellion you heard. And so I went to one event that was co-hosted by Community Coalition and others. It was on a Saturday morning. It was near Vermont and Manchester. And there was, the streets were shut down. And the streets were shut down not because of violence or a SWAT team response, but because a multicultural, multi-ethnic throng of activists and community residents were holding hands and walking down the street and marching in a parade in unison as a demonstration of what's different today than 25 years ago. It was powerful. And so that I mean, in a snapshot, that is why we do this. That's why we do what we do, was to see that happen, right? And everything coming out of this White House and this Congress flies in the face of that and threatens that. So I think the stakes are really high for sort of drawing down these lessons. And I think the key lessons, for philanthropy are be anchored in the reality of what communities like marginalized, stigmatized, oppressed communities are dealing with, A. B, be really good listeners. Lead through listening, which I think, Elwood, you embodied, and I think LOFT took on, and those of us as funders, and we try to pride ourselves on that. And then thirdly, we need to be bold and disruptive and activists in response. And so I would, not to put too much pressure here on us here in LA, but we are the base camp for the counter narrative. We are the base camp for the narrative for the resistance against an exclusive, punishment, divisive, mean-spirited narrative that's right now threatening to engulf this nation and take advantage of and take over our nation's sort of civic soul. And certainly we're not alone, but LA, from where it has come from 25 years ago to where it is today, tons of more work to be done. But better, for better or for worse, we are in the leadership role of showing this nation what a counter-narrative looks like in a very powerful and compelling way, if we can continue to learn from the lessons and stay together on this. I think the stakes are extremely high, and I think the timeliness for this conversation and downloading the conversations for all of us to move forward are critical.
I think you brought us to the crux here, yeah. I'd actually like to see if Wendy or Dannielle have thoughts. I mean, I know, Dannielle, you've, even within the constraints of a corporation, there's a new national narrative that you're trying to build that has to do with social change. And Wendy, so thoughts from either of you on sort of reactions to what Bob said. What lessons can we take out of Loft that might have some implications for this brave new world we've ended up in?
The evolution of where we're at today stems from what we've done for the last 2 decades. And the work that we've done, there's been a course that we've been on a path for the last 10 years. And what we've seen is, housing, affordable housing, community development, economic development, education, workforce, basic needs, were all these things we started funding in silos after post-crisis. We had to look at those safety net issues, but as time evolved, we talked, as Bob and Wendy are alluding to, this notion of race, income inequity, economic opportunity, race equity. I mean, things like Weingart is doing as well. We are all reframing our narrative around what it means to become economic or achieve economic mobility in communities that we serve. And I do think we have come to a place where it is about the continuum of organizations and continuum of whether it's basic needs to a job, whether it's hunger to a home, whether it's school to a job. I do think we're at a place where income inequality and economic equality is the social justice of our time, and that's how we're talking about it at the company. And what we all can bring to the table and assets that we bring to bear to drive economic opportunity in these communities. I mean, we are a national bank, but we act very locally. Our national foundation, I would say 70% of the funding goes to local markets. We let local markets make decisions based on the issues. Raul addressed, we spend, every year we go through a community needs assessments. We talk to our colleagues and our partners, community-based partners, about what those needs are in local communities, and we let the local markets decision. We provide strategy, but we let the local markets decision. And as folks said, in LA, it's a hotbed of homelessness, so we're involved in the homelessness initiative. Workforce, we're part of Workforce Collaboratives. Hunger, we're looking at hunger as an issue. And so there's a lot going on in LA, and if we can do it right, to Bob's point, we will pave the way for the rest of the country. And so I do think we're reflective on ourselves. I mean, we spend a lot of time with key community organizations. We created under Andrew Plepler the National Community Advisory Council, and we have executives and presidents that talk to Andrew and heads of lines of business on a monthly basis about the issues that we need to take a look at. So it says a lot, and we're worried. And we fund organizations like Lyft who get AmeriCorps funding, and we're sitting there talking to them about what are you going to do if AmeriCorps funding should go away? What is the emergency? Is there an emergency response to that? And we fund.
What's going to happen to hunger when the food stamp program is decimated?
Exactly, and so it's frightening. I mean, for us as we reflect back and think about are we going to look local? Are we going to work national? Or funding national models? But we also know that the local matters as well. So how do we bring national models to scale at the local level? I mean, we have to be, we have to be in a leadership role around this stuff and take risks because no one else is right now. And I think philanthropy plays a crucial role in that.
Just to be clear, can I just ask you, you said something I want to clarify. So part of your response to the situation we're in is the foundation is adopting a new narrative. You used the words economic justice and social justice. Are you telling me that a bank is using those words out loud, like at conferences and stuff?
Well, I will even take us, absolutely. I mean, I will take, if I can take it a step further, because Fred and Bob and others are in the room, and we made a commitment to the Renewing Communities Initiative. That is, you know, private foundations. Ford came in and said, we're going to look at the criminal justice system and the juvenile justice system and look at education and how in prison versus out of prison, looking at those pathways. Well, we committed $250,000 to that recently. And so, yes, I mean, we are taking a hard look at those kinds of issues that you would think a bank would not. And it's been an incredible journey the last couple of years to look at those types of things.
Wendy.
So when I listen to both Bob and Dannielle, to me, these are fundamental lessons we learned at LOF. I mean, foundations didn't partner with communities before we had this experience. Foundations, when things got messy, took our money and left. Communities, when things got messy. Foundations, when the partnerships went sour, walked away instead of figuring out how to make them work. Figuring out how to find other players, add players, figure out how to stay and keep talking until it worked. I mean, all of the work that's being done now requires that kind of relationship, those kinds of conversations. All of that was not the way we worked, at least here, before LOF. All of that grew out of the kinds of work that we did here. So when I hear where we've come over those 25 years, I mean, for me, very much where we are today grew out of the learnings that started 25 years ago in this work, which were eye-opening for most of us. And I don't think that we would even begin to know how to face the issues that we are facing today had we not done the work and begun those conversations the way we did 25 years ago.
What are the 2 or 3 things sort of to keep in mind for the next iteration of LOF?
That's what I was asking,
right?
yeah.
Okay.
That's what he meant to say.
So funny you should ask. And for me, there were 2 things that are interesting because neither one of them, you know, we're a health foundation, and neither one of them are really health, right? The 2 that certainly LOF introduced me and us to, I think and many of us to, is authentic, meaningful civic engagement and civic participation. Okay? From activism to voting to, you know, engaging parents as partners, as we saw in Pacoima. And so I think that is a very critical frontier because it's a base and a foundation for a lot of other things, right? School reform, justice reform, a whole bunch of stuff depends on civic engagement and civic participation. And the second is, I think it's incumbent upon LA, specifically in California generally, to show the nation what an inclusive, all-in economic strategy looks like.
Yeah.
What does it look like when you have an economic strategy with economic hope and opportunity that is not centered and founded on exclusion, divisiveness? You know, the Darwinian zero-sum game is, you know, white working class America can only move forward if these other people get marginalized and excluded and blamed, okay? And if we anchor that strategy in a tax cut, trickle-down economic strategy, right? That's the economic strategy coming out of Washington right now, is some combination of blame and tax cuts for the wealthy, right? And so somewhere in this nation, there needs to be the kind of, and this is where, having the banks and financial institutions are critical here. somewhere in this nation, somebody has to show that there is something known as an inclusive, all-in economic strategy that really does work and really can work. And California being the, what is it, 7th, 8th largest economy in the world, and LA with all the assets we have, I'm not saying we can handle that completely alone, but if we don't begin to show how that can be done, I actually worry that there's nothing to point to for the rest of the nation. Those are the two that strike me as the next hill to climb.
What are the models today? And, was this replicated? Is it being contemplated? What's gone on since 2006?
There's a framing, right? This collective impact framing. I was in Boston just last week, and two things. The youth in the room. I mean, youth to me now is 25 to 40 youth. but what strikes me
Thank you
is
for that.
I'm sorry, I should say more than that. But it is this mobilization that's taking place in these communities across the country, and I think it is trailblazers, it's these emerging leaders, it is these organizations that are looking around and saying, this is not my, however you want to frame it, I'm not going to take it to politics, but we've got to figure out a way to continue to support these models across the country. There is an organization that we support at Aspen called the Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund, where they're focused in 20 markets, and we're funding at the top and at the local market. Our local markets are funding organizations that are working in workforce particularly. There's, interesting enough, I'm looking at Cynic, we started our own neighborhood model called American Block by Block. If folks, anyone remember American Block by Block?
I do.
There's a few in the room, yes, where that was actually driven from community development as a community development model, where we said, we're going to take our lending and investing, focus in communities, and then philanthropy was brought to the table, interesting enough. And then we worked together and talked together locally around the table to think about that. But there are models. As I reflect on the conversation today, I was thinking about the models we look at, or we fund, like the Green Light Fund. There's a model that really comes in, brings experts from across the country, and imports them into a community. We can have a conversation about that. But I don't think there's a model out there, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that has replicated the LOFT model, the bimodal piece, but as I think about the organizations we work with, I don't think there's a model out there.
If we keep it general enough to say a funder collaborative combined with a place-based initiative, I'd say it has actually been replicated quite a bit. Shirley Fredericks, who's on our board, actually led a process at the Council on Foundations meeting here in Los Angeles where we had a 2-day learning laboratory, and out of that, 9 cities replicated some form of a place-based initiative combined with a funder collaborative. Beyond that, I think where we haven't done a good job is tracing where people, like I occasionally will bump into someone and they'll say, oh yeah, we started San Diego Neighborhood Funders. That's based on, oh great. So I think sometimes ideas take a life of their own and we haven't necessarily tracked it. But your question also speaks to the question about how do we be more, it was the question I raised earlier, how can we be more proactive in supporting collaboration in neighborhoods? And I think that's an open question.
LA Urban Funders did not spring whole from the head of Zeus. I mean, it really,
or Unix.
it really, I'm good at images. It's the way. It really came out of the failure of RLA to really address philanthropic issues, even through the philanthropic roundtable. And it came out of the frustration of meeting, month after month after month with RLA and realizing the only thing that was happening was that there were certain people who were, it was grant making in the old way without thinking about the whole problem or trying to address the whole problem. So just remember that most things do evolve and come out of some kind of crisis, and I think the next evolution in LA is going to come from that. The other thing I wanted to remind people of is that, and this is, I'm really speaking to both funders and community development people, but for funders, No matter how hard your workload, no matter what your guidelines say, never stop having conversations with people in the community about what it is they need, where they are they going. And even if you have to start that conversation with, I'm probably not going to be able to fund you, but I do want to have that conversation. And I think very often funders, watch the inbox grow and feel the need to kind of get focused on everything they've been told to be focused on. And for community development, people do the inverse of that. No matter what, don't think just in terms of your, meeting your year-end deadlines on funding and things. Think about the larger work that you're doing and how it fits, so it's really just an encouragement to stay as creative as you can, because that's how these things move forward and how they grow.
Sharon Evans from the Business Resource Group, Elwood. It's a pleasure. Many years in the trenches. I would like to focus a question around South LA. The South LA community did and still does suffer from a gap in economic opportunities. We're at a precipice with the Promise Zone designation of some supposed federal opportunities ahead of us. However, what do you see? We're seeing gentrification, specifically philanthropic gentrification happening, where through funding and foundational efforts, organizations that have had institutional roots in a community are not necessarily reaping benefits of foundation funding, and we're seeing a plethora of outside organizations being funded to come in and move it. So if we're listening to the voice of those located in those places, how does that factor into creating a place-based strategy when it's so much easier to just fund an outside organization to come in and deliver services, which we're seeing not working? So what's your thoughts on this whole nonprofit institutional building to support the place-based work, as opposed to we're seeing migration? Good ideas move, but there are organizations deeply rooted in communities that we're seeing defunded as new opportunities arise.
Yeah. It's disconcerting. I want to actually ask the panelists to speak, but first I'll say, Sharon, that back in 1992, that situation existed. And one of the, as I said earlier, one of the results of the study that Jan McElwee did was funders were surveyed, and we're actually surprised to look in the aggregate at how few were funding directly in South LA. And those that were often funding citywide organizations that just, as you say, that just happened to be delivering programs in South LA. And one of the refrains I often heard, I heard it from Wendy, from Caroline, was funders know nonprofits, we don't know neighborhoods. And so one of the learning opportunities that LOFT provided was a chance to kind of step back from the organizations they knew well and just say, all right, well, let's look in this geographic area. Let's look at all of the organizations that are out there, all of the informal associations that are out there. And that's why, as a result, what we saw is a network of organizations that at that time had never received foundation grants, and then all of them did. I think what your comment tells me is that this is an ongoing job, that you don't just do it once and then you're done. But what I think it also tells me is that it can be done. And I mean, that was pretty rapid. Within 2 years, something like 15 organizations went from never having a foundation grant to all of them having a foundation grant. So I think it can be done if the will is there. Would any of you like
But that it defaults back to the easier
That's right.
funding process pretty quickly is what I think I'm hearing. The other interesting day we had, which is interesting given what I've heard a couple times today, was it was a little startling to us to see how much money actually was flowing into South LA. And I say that Denise Fairchild did a day where we had transparencies of both government and this was early on in the LOFT process, both government and philanthropic dollars, and layer after layer after layer was showing the money that was going into South LA and the impact it was not having. I mean, we knew the impact it was not having, and it was very frustrating. I mean, and I'm guessing that is still going on. I mean, these were dollars that were coming in from government, from at every layer, federal, state, city, as well, and it was going all to the wrong places, is what clearly was going on. It was not having the impact it should be having. And that really had an impact on us, because clearly we knew we needed to get it to the right places. I'm guessing that's all still happening. And if we took a look at that again, we would find the same thing is going on. And so it's a matter of taking those resources and getting it into the community that matters. And we're still not doing that.
So I want to echo many of the sentiments that were expressed on the panel, and also reflect that I was ordered, commanded to go to the Loft Board by Gary Yates, then president of the California Wellness Foundation. And not only was I new to philanthropy, nobody I knew what wellness was, and that I had no idea what Loft was. But out of that, and over these years, have come these remarkable relationships and friendships, and that has been so meaningful. The question raised in the front row about how do we institutionalize, build, and strengthen the capacity of organizations in South Los Angeles just continues to boggle my mind, that we have all these people who want to do help, who form organizations, and then the bar changes. We get performance-based, evidence-based criteria. We get ways in which grassroots community folk who used to have a way of doing work in Pacoima in South LA no longer qualify. And I think we have to tackle that in some meaningful way, along with making it an economic opportunity, because nonprofits in South LA are an economic driver. So over these years of reflection and so much that I learned from Loft, I still find myself drawn to the question of capacity building. And in the room now, for those of you looking for a model, the South Los Angeles Transit Empowerment Zone, which probably is the newest model. 54 community organizations based at LA Trade Tech. In formation, but Benny, Cherise, I saw Fred here earlier, so many of the same people now looking at this opportunity that links transit, employment, and economic opportunity to high school, I'm going to say junior college and really date myself, community college opportunities, and create at least the beginning of a stronger fabric without doing something to stem the flow of playground to prison. You know, I don't know what is going to sustain us if we keep pushing people into a prison system and then they get sent out unable to reintegrate into society. So for those of us who still want to work, there are opportunities, and that's not a question, but I'd like to know if people still feel attracted to that mission of really going deeper and investing deeper in South LA, even though some of what's happening may have been tried before.
Fran, you've been on the funder side of this, right? So for every argument we hear that, so it's funny when I heard your observation, you know, what is it, where you stand depends on where you sit. It feels to me like we fund this generally the same cast of organizations and grantees sort of year after year. And so I actually have the opposite worry that we're not finding new organizations, you know, to fund. To Fran's question, yes, but you know, I go across this entire state and I've yet to meet a community that says, you know what, we have enough philanthropic funding, go take the money somewhere else. Everyone believes that they are underfunded and underfinanced and under-resourced, right? And they are, right? Everyone can make that case. And so what happens with Place is hopefully you get married to it. You get married to it. and you stick with it and you stay there, and presumably with a core set of institutions with whom you are trying to help them go from one place in their leadership trajectory, to another. And so, yes, I would agree with you that we should be, in this case, looking at South LA. But every time we pick a place, 10 places don't get picked. And so it's not right or wrong, it's just a tension that we all deal with and manage as leaders and investing resources. And this is my last comment, and then you can, I'll throw it. I just want to be, and Jim Ferris has heard me on this rant before here in these halls, the hallowed halls of USC and the Philanthropy Center. Our view in philanthropy generally is that we can innovate our way out of anything, or innovate our way into anything. So at the risk of heresy, innovation and models are important, they're critical. We way underappreciate power and voice. The reason why we can't scale stuff is not because of the lack of a new model or the lack of an innovation. The reason we can't scale is a lack of power. That is a board of supervisors, that is a state legislature, that is a Congress, that is a White House deal. That's what gets in the way of scaling up. Because it's not that we sort of lack another paper with a decision analysis and a cost-benefit analysis about how this model works versus the other. This White House is about to take billions of dollars out of Medicaid and out of care for the poor. They want to dismantle HUD. We don't have enough affordable housing now, and they're dismantling HUD, right? We are spending, to your point, Fran, $10 billion to incarcerate people, and $1 billion of those dollars to incarcerate young people. And here we are fighting over which organization should get a $50,000 grant. So I just want us to be conscious of where the real scalable impact battles are, and to be more conscious of place and policy and power. And that's my final plea.
The last comment sort of brings me back to work we've done at the center, Elwood and I did, starting on prioritizing place, where place matters, but you have to understand place is embedded in larger regional economies and tied to public policy. And it's all of those things that have to be working to get success. And then the final thing, as I thought about the whole day, the whole morning, I'm reminded of a quote by John Gardner, who said, "We are all faced with a series of great opportunities disguised as insoluble problems." So with that, think about it. Thanks for coming. Thanks for Elwood for putting this all together.